Hello there, friends, and welcome to episode 179 of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. Today, we are going to be talking all about why, for a lot of years, I actually wanted to keep my anxiety, even though I thought it was the one thing I wanted to get rid of. Okay, so welcome to this episode of SelfKind. As I mentioned in the little intro, today we're going to be talking about why, for a whole bunch of years, I actually wanted to keep my anxiety rather than shift it, which is what I thought I wanted. And there was a really pivotal moment where I realized that that's what I was doing. And in today's episode, yes, we're going to be talking about anxiety, but I think that you can apply these lessons and ideas to pretty much anything that you're trying to create or kind of disassemble in your life. So that might be trying to create a mindful movement habit. It might be around trying to treat yourself with more kindness. It might be around shifting anxiety. It can really apply to a whole bunch of different things. And we're going to go through a little bit of the story behind it. And then I'm going to give you kind of five ideas to actually take away and use. So a little bit about the story. So my life has absolutely been punctuated by anxiety. At times quite crippling, at other times just kind of like the backdrop hum of the computer, and kind of pretty present for a lot of years of my life. And I've spoken before about kind of that moment maybe 8 years ago where I really kind of hit what I considered to be like my rock bottom at the time. And that was very much anxiety driven, and the kind of anxiety that was there when I woke up in the morning and there when I went to bed at night. And if you had asked me what was it that I wanted, probably two things would have come out of my mouth: that I didn't want to feel anxious anymore, and that I wanted somebody else to fix me. Now, this idea of having someone else fix us, we're going to come back to that in a different episode, but this reality that I was like, I want to be rid of my anxiety, drove a lot of the support and help that I sought out. And I did a lot of the things, right? I was given a lot of tools by the various people that I, had helping me over the years, because we're talking about a pretty long span of time here. And, we used a whole bunch of different tools, a whole bunch of different techniques. And what I would find is that I was getting temporary and kind of short-term relief from anxiety, but it was still very present as just what felt like very much a part of me, a piece of me. And one of the things that I think is really important to recognize here is how much our brain wants to keep us aligned with our beliefs. So one of the things that is true about a human brain is that efficiency is key, right? We want to conserve energy by being efficient. And so that's why we move in very similar ways from day to day, and we think in very similar ways from day to day. And we have, beliefs that we kind of seek evidence for all the time. And one of the beliefs that I was seeking evidence for was that I am an anxious person. And I would describe myself that way. When I either was sort of thinking about my own identity in my head or even sort of sharing it with other people, experiencing anxiety was a big part of who I was, a big part of my identity. And so this is an important piece both of the story and of the puzzle, because when it comes to anything, whether it's anxiety, whether it's adding more mindful movement into our lives, finding ways to treat ourselves with more kindness, the easiest behavior to continue to play out is the behavior that aligns with who we believe ourselves to be. So if we believe ourselves to be someone who doesn't exercise, who is lazy, and I'm not suggesting that if you don't exercise, you're lazy, but these are some of the beliefs that might be in there, right? That we're lazy, that we never commit to anything, that we always let ourselves down, that we're always anxious, that we're always whatever. It's easier to continue to behave or live in alignment with those beliefs, even when we have the best intentions to change how we do things. And so understanding what we believe about ourselves is really important. I didn't recognize this for a really long time though. And what happened was, after using all of these tools for, it really was years, I had one therapist who said to me, "Are you really ready to be free of anxiety?" And nobody had ever asked me that question before. And I immediately wanted to answer like, of course I am. This is why I'm paying you the monies. But in my gut, I was like, how do I answer that question? And the only way that I could answer that question truthfully was to say, no, I'm actually not ready to be free of this anxiety. And the recognition for me came from kind of just realizing that I didn't know who I was without anxiety. I didn't know how to be in relationship with other people without my anxiety. I didn't know how to do life without anxiety because it was uncomfortable, but it was incredibly familiar and predictable in that regard. And so, that was a little bit of a moment of clarity of like, wow, no, I'm actually not ready to be free of this anxiety. And if we kind of relate that to any of these other things, right? Creating a movement practice, wanting to be in a more kind relationship with ourselves, whatever it might be, there are absolutely times in our life where we might believe that that's what we want. But actually, when we get to the truth of it, we're not ready for what that entails. We're not ready to find the space. Maybe we're truly not even able to, right? Depending on the season and stage of our lives. And I just think it's an interesting idea to get really honest with ourselves. And with this example of, perhaps including or incorporating more mindful movement into our lives or practices of self-care, one of the things that comes to mind for me with this is that we might be like, yeah, actually, I'm not ready. I'm not ready to treat myself that way, or I'm not ready to do those things because actually at my core, I really do believe I'm the kind of person who doesn't do that. But then we might also go, but I don't want to be that, right? Like I don't want that. And that was my recognition with the anxiety piece, was I realized that, yeah, no, I'm not ready to be rid of this, but I also don't want it to be my reality. So who do I have to be? Or what do I have to experience about myself to open up the space for this to be a possibility? So it wasn't so much that, no, I never want to be rid of my anxiety. It was like, I do want to be rid of it, but because it is so integrated into who I am, I can't simply shed it. Like it just didn't feel like that was possible. Interestingly enough, fast forward a few more years and I was truly ready to put that down. And now as a, human, I do still experience anxiety, but I don't define myself as somebody who is anxious, and I don't experience it daily. And I don't experience it as kind of like this constant hum in the background. It's something that comes and it's something that goes, and it's something that I don't define myself by. And when I was ready to kind of drop that as part of my identity, then I did, and it was a lot easier. But there were things that happened in the interim that made that a lot easier. And that's where I want to go to next, is this, giving you some tangible tips, because it's one thing for me to tell you a story. It's quite another for us to know, like, okay, this is definitely, setting off some ideas in my mind and some recognition and some insight perhaps, but like, what do I do with that? So let's talk about sort of 5 things that maybe are a little bit more tangible, a little bit more useful to sort of take out into the world and play with for yourself. So I'm just going to refer to my notes because I've written 5 things down. And the first one is to recognize just what we talked about a moment ago, that it is easier to take action aligned with who you believe yourself to be than it is to take action that is misaligned with that. Does that mean that we are destined to just keep behaving in the same way and not be able to reach our goals or live out things that we desire for ourselves? And the answer, of course, to that is no. It's not a jail cell. It's not a unchangeable thing. And so tip 2 is that when we do feel like we're trying to shift towards a version of ourselves or kind of start to question some of those beliefs that we might hold, one of the easiest ways to do that is to do something different. So we've just talked about that. Yes, it's actually easier to continue to take action that aligns with who you kind of you believe yourself to be under the surface. But in order to start shifting that, often we have to do something different, right? And so here is that magical, or not even magical, that uneasy place of, but I don't feel motivated to do it, or I find myself continually giving up on myself. And this is where, we have the opportunity to back ourselves a little bit and to know that we can do things even in the absence of motivation, and we can do it through a lens of kindness because we know what it is that we're moving toward. So from a movement point of view, this might be, recognizing that, I have this belief that I'm never going to commit to anything from a movement point of view, or I have this belief that at the heart of it, I'm just lazy. And so we recognize, okay, I have this belief. The easiest thing for me to do is going to be to continue to live in alignment with that. But I don't want that to be, who I see myself as. And so what's a small action that I can take that actually starts to provide evidence for the behavior or the action that I do want to take? And so it might be 5 minutes of walking around the block. It might be 5 minutes of yoga. It might be whatever, right? So we start to take these small actions. And we notice, now that we know what the belief is, we notice when it pops up and when it sort of says, hey, I'm here to intervene and interfere with your new plan. And we have to have some level of commitment to what it is that we want, but without punishing ourselves over that. There is a very big difference between motivation, that, sort of esoteric idea of just like motivation falling from the sky and making us feel like doing everything we ever wished for, versus punishment, versus action that's driven by kindness, action that's driven by a recognition of what it is that we want for ourselves, without shame, without guilt, without all of that sort of sticky, kind of murky stuff. Really just a recognition of what it is we want to move towards. And so those small actions are ways of collecting evidence, kind of as like evidence. I won't even try to come up with a second good word. It's a way of collecting evidence for the fact that we can be that, right? So the third one is to honor the seasons of your life and honor your reality. So often we hear these sayings like, we all have the same 24 hours in a day, or if I can do it, you can do it. And it's not really helpful, because the reality is that just because I can do something doesn't actually mean that you have the resources to do the same. And just because I see somebody else do something doesn't mean that I have the current capacity or resources to match them. And so really there's a deep need, I think, to be not only honest about what it is that we're experiencing, what it is that we want, but what it is that we have the capacity to do. And so, just a few years ago, I didn't have the same capacity for self-care activities, like actual time, as I do now with both of my kids in school and running a business that, I decide on my hours. Likewise, if it's just important that we recognize that not always are we able to just be like, well, we all have the same amount of time and we all have the same resources and we all have the same whatever. No, we have to honor where it is that we're at. And within that, recognizing that we don't always know what to do next, and we don't always have the stamina to be like our only cheerleader. Sometimes we need support from other people. And this is where, particularly if it's something around anxiety or changing our behavior, the support of a really good therapist or coach or whatever can be so incredibly valuable. And so recognizing that, hey, you may not have the capacity to go in at 8,000%, but maybe you can go in at 50%, and maybe you can actually, get some other people on your side so that you don't have to, carry the load of, because it's hard to change, right? Like, it is actually hard to do things differently because that's just not how we're wired. And so recognizing how helpful that can be, I think, is really valuable. And then recognizing the times that we have, wins, regardless of how small they are. We want to be celebrating those moments where we're like, yes, I'm moving in the direction of what it is that I want. And so for me, some of those sort of like small wins were even just in my language around anxiety. Instead of describing myself as an anxious person, kind of recognizing that feeling and being like, wow, I'm experiencing anxiety right now. In this moment, I'm having an experience of anxiety, and starting to kind of take my self-definition out of the way that I described it. And that was a really significant, but perhaps small, depending on how you think about it, win. And so our human brains, and this is tip number 5, our human brains are going to look for the ways that we fail. Our human brains are going to look for potential threat. Our human brains are going to be looking for things that go against the norm or how things have always been. And when we realize that that's just a very human brain sort of thing to do, we can start to realize that we are not failing when we are kind of like stuck on the negative or noticing the ways that we're, quote unquote failing, as opposed to being able to like really dive in and attach to those wins. And so we have to be conscious of that. We have to be conscious of the way that our human brain works, recognizing that it does have a bias to negativity. It does have a bias towards seeking out, or not seeking out, it doesn't want them, but looking for threats so that we can manage them. And so when we have these little wins, giving ourselves the space to be like, hey, look at what I just did, can be so important and so valuable. So they're the five hopefully somewhat tangible tips to be able to start thinking about, if there's this thing that we keep saying that we want and we're not actually able to move towards it, that we can kind of get a little bit more curious to see, like, do I even want it for a start? Do I have the resources and capacity to go after it? And where might I need some support, either from someone else or from this recognition of how our humanity works, right? How our human brain works, how our nervous system works, to be able to say that, I'm not failing. My brain's not failing either. It's just doing its job. But using that information to move us in the direction of what we want, and doing it with this recognition that we don't tend to just like, it's not like a before and after, right? There's all this space in between of, I wasn't moving as often as I wanted to, and now I am, and there was all this space in between. Or I defined myself as an anxious person and felt anxious every single day of my life, to now I have moments of anxiety, but it doesn't define who I am. And there's all this space in between where we get to be in relationship with our humanity, in relationship with what it is to be a human, and the fact that that is not linear. It is not always tidy. It is not always even very comfortable. And yet we show up for it, and we get curious, and we stay kind in the process. So I hope that that is some useful information. And if you have questions, of course, as always, come and connect with me. You'll find me over on Instagram at Erica Webb _SelfKind. And I will be back next week.